Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's workshop on misinformation. My name is Julia, and I'm an articling student with the CCLA. And just before we get started, just a reminder that there is a section that you can ask questions in. So we welcome questions throughout, but I believe Cara will get to them at the end of her presentation. So it's my pleasure to welcome Cara here, who's going to be walking you through this workshop. She is a lawyer and the director of our Fundamental Freedoms program here at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. She graduated from McGill University with a degree in political science, from Osgoode Hall Law School with a law degree, and from New York University with a Master of Laws degree. So I will pass it on to Cara.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for joining me today and for being here. I hope you've had a good couple of days. So I'm talking about issues around misinformation, and one of the areas that I cover at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association is freedom of expression, and this topic is very kind of tied up with that issue. So yeah, I'm gonna show you a couple of slides. I have a little PowerPoint ready to go here. And as Julia mentioned, I'm really happy to hear your questions, and thank you to those of you who completed your surveys. I enjoyed reading your answers, and I'll try to sort of work in some of what you've asked about as we go through. So I'm gonna start. So this is an article, I guess you might call it, and you can read the headline: "Trans species man who self-identifies as a deer accidentally shot by hunters." So there's a couple of different ways to maybe interpret this story. It might be a story that is poking fun at or making fun of or undermining the experience and voices of transgender people. It might be making fun of people who do make fun of and undermine the existence and experience of transgender people. Sometimes you hear people who are who question, I guess, the validity of a transgender person's experience as saying, well, you know, I feel like I was a deer. So that could be what this story is about. But this is the headline, and I'm gonna show you. So this is from a website, World News Daily Report. You can see it says "Where Facts Don't Matter." It is a clearly labeled satirical site, so it's intended to be a joke. It may or may not be something that you personally find funny, but it's at least arguably sort of an innocent attempt at humor, and it's clearly labeled. I mean, I put here the label that shows up on the sort of main page, but if you were to click on about on this website, it would lay out very clearly that these are not factual stories. In fact, I think at one point they say any connection to or similarity to real events is a miracle. So they're really trying to demonstrate that this is intended to be funny. And so there's at least possibly no malicious intent in the initial publication of this story online. But then what happens is that this piece is republished on social media and by other media without any disclaimers or references to the initial site. Now, if you were to read, I didn't put the text of the story in. If you were to read it, I would like to think that most people would recognize that this is quite obviously an attempt at satire and humor. But we can't assume that everyone sees the world the same way that we do. So this piece is picked up and gets put on this site, which looks a little more like what you might expect a news site to say. So it's called Newsbreak. It's labeled in the crime and safety area. It's about someone being shot. So it starts to look like maybe there's this might be a genuine story. Then you get someone posting it on social media. I'm going to assume that most of you know what the FFS stands for, and I'm not going to say it out loud. But so it says FFS, you couldn't make it up, right? And there's laughing and crying, and I mean, in fact, you could make it up because, of course, it is made up. But this is an example of someone who has taken this satirical piece, put it on their social media, and at least as far as I could tell, not really attempted to demonstrate or to show that this was put up as a piece of satire. And if you go and look at the person that posted this, just so you can see his sort of short Twitter bio, one of the things he says is absurdities of, quote, climate change / woke / multi-genders / leftism are there to be mocked. So this seems like someone who's like probably a bit of a jerk, to be honest, right? But it's clear that this person has posted this satirical piece in an attempt to kind of, be controversial, to poke fun at people, maybe to undermine, the rights of people to exist and to identify in the way that they identify. And the initial context in which that, satirical piece appeared has completely vanished. So I used sort of a bit of a silly example to show that I think not every, and we will get to talking about the realities that people use online tools to try and mislead people and to try and misinform people and to try and do damage. But that even something that may start off as something innocent or something that's clearly labeled as humor, trying to be labeled as humor, can become and be used as a way to divide people. So I want to get some definitions out of the way because, and these are, I mean, this is still sort of an area that people are learning about, right? We're still, I know you all have grown up on the internet. When I was going to high school, I didn't get my first email address until I was in undergrad. So, so that's how old I am. And just to say that the internet is not, it's not quite as old as you think. And this way of communicating online and the way of sharing information and the way that information can be spread online is not as, it's not that old. And so we're still kind of learning about it. And so these definitions are ones that I'm going to use today, and some that I've seen in some of the literature, but there's probably different ways to talk about some of these things. So when I talk about misinformation, I'm going to talk about things that are false, but where there's not an intention to mislead. So this might be something like a legitimate news site that makes an error in their story, and then, the next day might publish a retraction or a correction because something new has come to light and they've realized that they made a mistake. Disinformation is the kind of more nefarious, I guess, species of this, where you have something that's false and that it's being spread with the intention of misleading and maybe doing some damage. Malinformation is something that is sort of based in reality, but purposely misleading. So this is the kind of thing where I was thinking about, I don't know if any of you saw kind of early on in the pandemic, maybe over the summer, there were lots of pictures that we saw that looked like people gathering together in big crowds. And those were genuine photographs of real life events. But the perspective on the photo was taken in such a way that people appeared to be closer to each other than they were. I would say that's to the extent that someone does that intentionally and posts that intentionally to try to say, look, we have these huge crowds gathering together. I'd say that's kind of an instance of malinformation, where there is this kind of kernel of truth or something that's based in reality, but it's misleading. And then these two other terms that I have on this slide, propaganda and satire, are sort of broader level ideas. So propaganda is information that is biased or misleading to promote a cause or point of view. And I think, I mean, I'd be interested when we have some time to discuss this if some of you think it's possible, but I think some propaganda can actually be full of truthful and accurate information and still be propaganda, right? It's still presented in a biased way and intended to promote a particular point of view. Propaganda can also certainly have misinformation or disinformation. And then satire is, you know, an attempt at humor or irony or way of ridiculing something to try and expose or criticize it. So I think there can be these three sort of misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation built into propaganda and built into satire. And so if we go back to our trans species man, I think it arguably falls into a couple of these categories. It started off as satire with the satirical site that put it up. Then maybe potentially legitimate news site. I think probably those of you who did your homework, if you took a closer look at that news site, might have reason to question whether that was a legitimate site, but it's certainly not clearly labeled as being a satire site. So then we have sort of misinformation, where maybe someone has published this without recognizing it as satire. And then maybe the social media, you know, the tweeting out of it is possibly an instance of disinformation, where I'm not sure if the original poster kind of knew that this came from a satirical site, but if he did, he certainly didn't care to make that known to people. You know, I asked you on the survey if you'd ever sort of been tricked by a fake news story, and many of you said yes. I think probably close to half said yes, and some sort of said not that I know of, but kind of acknowledged that it's possible that you've been tricked without realizing it. And you can see, I mean, it is easy to do that, and sometimes there's not much at stake if you're sort of maybe tweeting about, you know, celebrity news or whether a show has been canceled or something. But you can imagine that if you're talking about, you know, someone who's running in an election campaign, or if you're talking about the latest public health advice, say during a pandemic, that sometimes misinformation or disinformation can have really significant consequences. So if we accept that this misinformation, disinformation, malinformation is a problem, how do we deal with it? So first of all, if you thought in coming to this session that I was going to have an answer to that question, you would be mistaken. This is a really complicated and difficult area. And I've been thinking about this now for a couple of years, actually. And Julia, who you saw before, has also done some research for this, research about this for me. And the federal government right now is looking at some of these issues. And there are consultation processes that are happening where the government is saying, you know, how do we address this problem of misinformation? We want to start passing laws to deal with it. What should those laws look like? And it's really difficult to answer those questions. So I don't have answers to those questions, but what I do think I have at this point is a bit of a framework for thinking about how to answer those questions. And where I start is with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So I've got a couple of sections that we're going to talk about that are relevant to this issue. And the first one is Section 2B. So Section 2B says that everyone has the freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including freedom of the press and other media communications. So this is a very broad guarantee of freedom of expression that we have in the Charter. And the way that our courts have interpreted it is to say that really anything that has expressive content, any way of expressing yourself, generally is going to be covered by Section 2B, except for acts of violence or threats of violence. So I might say that, I'm expressing myself if I decide to punch someone in the face, but that's not a protected form of expression. Similarly, if I, threaten to kill someone, I might say, well, I'm just expressing myself. That's, again, not something that the courts have considered that Section 2B covers. But really beyond those kind of extremes, a lot of things can be expression. There's a case where I think the court gives an example of someone parking in a handicapped parking spot as a means of expression, and they say, this seems like a mundane act where you just park in a parking spot, but if someone is parking in that parking spot to try and protest, that they feel it's unfair that the placement of handicapped parking spots, for example, then that would be something that would be covered under freedom of expression. So it's a really broad guarantee. And I don't know how many of you, some of you may be in law class or have taken law at grade 11 or grade 12 law. But you probably know that what the charter does is constrain what the government can do. So this guarantee of free expression doesn't mean that if you tell off your parents, they can't, ground you or punish you. The charter doesn't protect you there. But what it does mean is that the government can't put restrictions on your freedoms, subject to some things that we're going to get to in a few minutes. The other thing that's potentially relevant to this issue is Section 15.1 of the Charter, which is the equality guarantee. And what Section 15.1 says is that every individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to the equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination. And then it lists a number of sort of personal characteristics that you can't be discriminated against on the basis of these things. And I should say that even though there's a list built into the Charter, our courts have said that that list is not exhaustive. So sexual orientation isn't on this list. The courts have said sexual orientation is a characteristic that is just like these other characteristics that are listed. And so we're going to treat it the same way. You can't be discriminated on the basis of sexual orientation. So the equality guarantee, says that the law is supposed to treat people equally and not discriminate. And actually in Canada, we have a really, what I would say progressive and sort of substantive definition or understanding of equality, because we recognize that equality doesn't necessarily mean treating everyone the same, that sometimes we have to recognize that people are not all starting in the same place, right? We have to level the playing field and make sure that people who have suffered discrimination for a long period of time aren't disadvantaged as a result of that. And so programs that are aimed at dealing with past discrimination, for example, don't violate the equality guarantee. And this is relevant because to this question of misinformation, because misinformation is often used as a way to pit groups against each other, right? To cause tension and controversy among different communities. Sections of the Charter that you may not have seen. They're sort of a little less talked about, and they're kind of sections that help interpret the Charter overall. So Section 25 is a guarantee that things set out in the Charter aren't intended to take away from existing Aboriginal treaty or other rights and freedoms that pertain to the Aboriginal peoples of Canada. Section 27 says that the Charter should be interpreted in a way that's consistent with preserving and enhancing Canada's multicultural heritage. And Section 28 says that the rights and freedoms referred to in the Charter are guaranteed equally to male and female persons. And actually, when I was preparing for this talk, it's the first time that it occurred to me that the Charter itself has used language which is arguably now sort of outdated in talking about male and female persons as if they make up the exclusive realm of persons in Canada. But again, I think there could be an argument that courts would say, well, that was intended just to mean that there shouldn't be differential treatment on the basis of gender identity. So these are sort of interpretive pieces of the Charter. And then what I think is probably the most significant is Section 1. And Section 1 of the Charter says that all of the rights and freedoms that are set out in the Charter are subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. And I mean, this is really where the rubber hits the road with all of our charter rights, right? So when I said before that the charter constrains what the government can do, it does constrain what the government can do, but it doesn't constrain them absolutely. This very first section of the charter demonstrates that governments can pass laws that limit our rights, but those limits have to be reasonable. And when the charter says that they have to be demonstrably justified, to me, that means that if the government is going to restrict your right or limit your right in some way, they need to demonstrate why they have to do that, right? They need to give some evidence. They need to try and establish what it is they're trying to achieve and why what they're doing is going to achieve that goal. So some of you, if we at CCLA have ever been into your classroom and done a presentation, you might have seen this before. But what we have is a sort of shorthand version of what the courts do when they're trying to think through whether a limit on your rights and freedoms is reasonable or not. And this is relevant to this question of misinformation, because if the government is going to try and tackle this problem, it's probably going to mean passing some laws that say that you can't do certain things, or imposing some sort of consequences or punishments on people who do certain things, right? Who spread misinformation or disinformation. So if we're trying to figure out whether a restriction on a right or freedom is reasonable or not, the first question we ask is, what is the purpose, right? What is the government trying to achieve in doing this? And very often that's the easy part, right? The government will usually be able to come up with a good justification. Right now, if you're sort of paying attention to the news, you know that we have a lot of restrictions on our liberties and our freedoms. And the purpose is to deal with the public health crisis, right? And that is a important purpose. And so it's going to be very hard for people to say, that's not something we care about. That's not something we think the government should be involved with doing. And similarly, there would be probably good and important purposes in trying to deal with disinformation and misinformation online, right? Trying to keep, first of all, trying to make sure that you have a citizenry that is well informed, and trying to make sure that, you know, that people have the right information when they go to make decisions, but also kind of social harmony if the disinformation is used to divide people. The second thing you want to ask is, assuming you have a good purpose, does the measure that the government has put in place work, right? Does it help to actually achieve that purpose, or is there kind of a mismatch there? And then you want to think about kind of the side effects. What else will this measure do? So I'm going to talk a little bit about an older Supreme Court of Canada case. And again, if you've studied law, you might have talked about this case in class. This is R versus Zundel, and Zundel was a Holocaust denier who published in Canada a book called "Did 6 Million Really Die?" Which really questioned whether the Holocaust was historical fact, or whether it was either an exaggeration or a total fabrication put forward by a worldwide Jewish conspiracy. And Mr. Zundel was prosecuted under the criminal code. The section was called "Spreading False News." So very older case, but very relevant to kind of the issues that we're talking about today. And the provision said that everyone who willfully publishes a statement, tale, or news that he knows is false, and that causes or is likely to cause injury or mischief to a public interest, is guilty of an indictable offense and liable to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 2 years. So this is a basic sort of criminal provision that you could see as maybe an option that, you know, a modern government would consider in trying to tackle the issue of online misinformation and disinformation. And it's got some protections in it, right? You have to know that it's false. You have to be trying to cause some harm. And so the question when this case got to the Supreme Court of Canada is, does this provision violate freedom of expression? Does it limit freedom of expression? And if it does, is it a reasonable restriction? And the majority of the Supreme Court found that the restriction on freedom, that this was a restriction on freedom of expression and that it could not be justified. And again, I mean, I mentioned earlier that Section 2B, the freedom of expression protection, is really broad. So there were some arguments that were put forward to say, look, this freedom of expression was never intended to protect lies. And, you know, lies don't have any value in terms of trying to further dialogue and discussion. So it's not something that Section 2B should protect. So the majority rejected that idea. And I pulled this quote from the decision because I thought it was particularly interesting and relevant, that in 1992, the former Chief Justice put this into these terms. So she says, so she's rejecting this idea that even lies, even intentional lies, can never have value. She says, exaggeration, even clear falsification, may arguably serve useful social purposes linked to the values underlying freedom of expression. A person fighting cruelty against animals may knowingly cite false statistics in pursuit of his or her beliefs and with the purpose of communicating a more fundamental message. For example, cruelty to animals is increasing and must be stopped. This is the one that I found a little bit freaky in light of what's going on today. A doctor, in order to persuade people to be inoculated against a burgeoning epidemic, may exaggerate the number or geographical location of persons potentially infected with the virus. And then she goes on to give another example about how a lie might be useful for artistic purposes. So there's this recognition that we can't just say that even intentional lies have no positive value, right? You might be trying to achieve something good by telling a lie. If or when you become parents, you might find this very useful. Sometimes there are little lies that you need to tell your kids for the greater good. So this is sort of an example of that. And the court is rejecting this idea and saying, no, even though these are intentional, these may be intentional falsehoods, that doesn't mean they don't benefit from the protection of freedom of expression. The other problem that the court identifies in saying, well, things that are false shouldn't be protected is it's pretty hard to figure out what is false sometimes, right? It can be hard to distinguish fact from fiction. It can also be hard to distinguish fact from opinion. And we have that freedom of opinion. We have that freedom of thought. We want people to be able to exercise that. And so if you decide that only the truth is protected, you need to decide who gets to adjudicate what is the truth. And then, so they accept that this is a restriction of freedom of expression, and the majority says it's not saved by Section 1. It's not a reasonable restriction on freedom of expression. Partly they look at the history. So, and I think it's interesting to think about whether a similar provision would be looked at differently today if it was brought in to deal with the kind of issues that we're talking about, that the problems that misinformation and disinformation can cause. But actually, this provision, Section 181 of the Criminal Code, was really designed to protect like nobles during the times when royals ruled. So it's really about making sure that you can't slander your government or your monarch. And the government, when this case was being argued, tried to say no. I mean, that might have been the initial intention, but now it's really about racial harmony, and it's exactly this kind of provision that should be used to deal with someone like Ernst Zundel, who's denying the Holocaust. The court said, no, you can't just sort of shift things around like that. So there wasn't really a compelling purpose, but they said, even if we accept that this has the purpose of trying to ensure kind of social harmony, the provision is overly broad, right? And again, they sort of get back to those same problems. How do we decide what's true? How do we decide what's false? And I should say that there was, I think Zundel was a decision rendered by only 7 of the 9 Supreme Court justices. And so the majority was 4 judges. And there was a dissent of 3 judges. So 3 judges would have said, no, this is a reasonable restriction on freedom of expression, and they would have upheld that section. So it's only kind of by the narrowest of margins that we don't have this law on the books anymore. But as a result, the prosecutions, which had been successful against Mr. Zundel, were thrown out because he was charged under an unconstitutional law. So some of you asked about this on the surveys, whether the internet has kind of changed things in terms of whether it's easier to spread lies online. And my answer to that would be an emphatic yes. It is definitely a lot easier. And part of it has to do with, first of all, just the volume of content that is online. I can't remember the statistic about, how many hours of YouTube videos are uploaded every second, but it's something that's just preposterous to kind of wrap your head around. There is so much content that is going out on the internet every day, and it's going out at a rapid speed. It can be spread really quickly too. So there's the volume, right? And if you think of the internet as kind of a library where there's just new books or new content coming in, every minute, trying to categorize that content into fiction and nonfiction, it's just not something that anyone can keep up with, because there's just too much of it. So even sites that attempt to do this fact checking, or that try to categorize things appropriately, it can be a really big challenge because of the volume. The other significant thing is that platforms like Facebook and Google and Twitter and Snapchat have big monopolies. So, when I mentioned before the charter kind of constrains government action, Facebook can censor you if they want to, right? They are not a government actor, and they can decide, you've violated our terms, or we don't like what you're putting out there. You're not going to have access to this platform anymore. And if we had a competitive kind of environment, you'd say, okay, well, that's fine. I can go somewhere else and sort of get access to the same service. But the truth is that these platforms are so large that doesn't really exist. So that can create a bit of a problem that feeds into the misinformation. The other thing is that we become really increasingly, we rely on social media as a way to get news and information. So I asked on the survey where you get your information from, and a lot of you said that you get it from, you check news websites, or you watch TV or video that come from kind of reputable news sources like the CBC or CTV. But a lot of you also said you get it a lot from your social media feeds. And that might be that you're getting, links to things, which you may or may not be clicking through to look at. But we've sort of taken, relying on those social media feeds means that you're looking to kind of friends and people as reliable sources of information, rather than kind of checking the original source and looking at, the person who wrote this article, do they subscribe to sort of a code of ethics that journalists subscribe to? Is it easy to find out who wrote this article? Is it, if they rely on anonymous sources, have they explained why they're relying on anonymous sources? Are there firsthand accounts written into some of these pieces? So by substituting, in some cases, social media for the original source, you just get that, you get further and further away from checking the credibility. And we're going to talk in a bit about ways that you can try and make sure that what you're looking at is something reliable. The other thing that the internet does is it allows for anonymity, and it allows for artificial intelligence. So you may follow people on social media who may not actually be people at all. They may be bots that are putting out content for specific purposes, and there's all kinds of purposes. There's sort of sketchy purposes that are trying to do damage in the political system. There's also a lot of marketing purposes and things like that. So, and it's not always easy to tell whether whether an individual on social media is a real person or is a bot. And then the other thing is that there are good reasons why some people, some real genuine people, may want to be anonymous online, right? You might want to do things online anonymously to protect yourself from retribution by your employer, or to protect yourself from if you come from a country with a repressive regime and you have family members there and you want to speak out about the repressive regime, you don't want your family members to be harmed. So there's valid reasons why people might want to speak and express themselves anonymously online, but the fact that they can do so makes it harder to check sort of what's credible and reliable. And then a big issue online is the use of algorithms. And my guess is that probably a lot of you have a better understanding of this than I do. But basically, the way that these algorithms that are used on platforms and generally sort of on the internet are doing a whole bunch of things that are really fueling the spread of misinformation and disinformation. One is on social media, that, on Facebook and Twitter, the algorithms are set up so that what appears in your feed are things that get the most engagement, right? Things that people click on and like or look at, spend time on. And often it's not the things that are true that are going to be the ones that people engage with the most, right? Things that are shocking, things that have a really, a clickbait type headline. They call it clickbait for a reason. People are going to click on it, they're going to look at it, they're going to engage with it, and that pushes it up in order of priority on the algorithm, so that you're more likely to see things that are that may not be true just because people engage with them more. There's also this sort of phenomenon of like a filter bubble, where basically, because the algorithm is suited to your experience online, right? It pays attention to what you do and where you go online. It pays attention to what you like and what you read, and it wants to reinforce those things. So it ends up feeding you things that you are really ready to eat up. So the idea is that often what shows up in your feeds are things that are going to reinforce and confirm the kind of biases and beliefs that you already have. And you really have to, in some cases, kind of go out of your way to find things that don't do that. And I think it's really worthwhile trying to do that. There are some really interesting projects where people try to do this. So I think it was I can't remember if it was the Wall Street Journal. I can't remember which publication it was, but there was a newspaper that did, they set up two different feeds, red feed and blue feed, they called it. And this is in the States, where they're, talking about red states and blue states. And they basically set up a kind of persona of what they, I guess, characterize as a typical Republican person, and then a persona of a typical Democrat. And they see how the feeds, just even the news feeds, the kind of what Google feeds to you in sort of your news updates, vary significantly based on the kind of profile that you have. There are fact-checking sites, and a lot of the social media companies now are also trying to do fact-checking. They're using third-party companies to fact-check things that are flagged as potentially false. I put on the slide ineffectiveness of fact-checking, partly because there's, like I said, there's so much volume that it's really hard to keep up with this. and also because, I mean, it's not necessarily the case that all of these fact-checking sites are credible and use the kind of the right kind of tools that we'd want to see to make sure that they're actually appropriately checking facts. And then I mentioned the priority of search results because, I mean, this might be a way that you know, if you read about something, you become curious about it, you decide to go searching on Google for more information. First of all, Google sometimes will, you know, fill in the rest of your search based on the first couple of words or letters that you type in. They have a predictive technology to try and guess at what you're looking for. But even aside from that, the priority in which search results shows up can have a really big impact, right? I think there's studies that say that, I mean, it's very rare for people to kind of go onto the second page of search results on Google. And very often it's just the first, you know, 2 or 3 search results that you'd really click on to take a look at. So we are relying a lot on Google and the algorithm to provide us with that information. And this is an example where maybe you can see how significant something like that can be. And I don't want to suggest that that this is the, so sorry, let me give you the context here. So this is about Dylan Roof, who was really a boy, a young man who went into a largely Black church in Charleston, South Carolina, and killed 9 people during a Bible study. And he actually went in and participated in the Bible study for a little while. And then when people closed their eyes to pray, he pulled out his gun and shot them. And it was, I mean, it's a terrible, obviously terrible crime. And he had a whole kind of manifesto that he wrote online that sort of explained part of where he was coming from. And one of the things that he talked about was that he had been reading about Trayvon Martin. So some of you might remember Trayvon Martin was a young Black man who was walking, I think it was in Florida, and was shot by a sort of civilian security guard. The kid was unarmed. He was just walking and minding his own business. And he was shot because he was perceived by the security guard as some sort of threat. Now, when Dylan Roof started reading about Trayvon Martin, he obviously already had a certain bent and certain ideas about race, because he read about that case and thought that this was probably a justified shooting. But he also decided to go onto Google, and he typed in Black on white crime into Google. And in his sort of description of what motivated him to do this shooting, he says, "I have never been the same since that day. The first website I came to was the Council of Conservative Citizens. There were pages upon pages of these brutal Black on white murders. I was in disbelief." So the Council of Conservative Citizens is a white supremacist, a white nationalist website and organization. It was the first search result that came up when he typed in this this search term, and it led him to pages and pages of false information and statistics about the extent to which Black people kill white people. Right? Not true. But it was really fed to him in a way that that made it seem credible. And he obviously was ready to take that information, right? I don't want to suggest that Google's to blame for what he did, but I think it's a good example of how these things can kind of come together and do real harm. And I mean, Google has tried to address some of these issues. But this is one example that I found, really, really interesting. So how do we avoid spreading false information? So first of all, you should be looking for the original sources of things. Don't just look at the headline on your social media feed. Go to the story. Ideally, actually, don't even click through on social media. Go to the original source, to the original web page. Look at the story there. Look for things like whether it says who authored the piece. If you could find a biography of the author of the piece and see, are they someone who's studied journalism? Do they subscribe to a code of ethics? Does the publication subscribe to a code of ethics? Some publications, some newspapers, for example, are part of media councils where it's a voluntary thing, but basically a media council is somewhere where you could complain to a media council if you think you see something false in one of the publications, and there'll be an investigation to look at whether that's false or credible. And usually if an organization has proactively decided to join a media council, it's because they at least have faith in their processes to make sure that they're vetting their stories appropriately. And you should also try and kind of curate your own news feed, not just rely on what the algorithm sends you. So find some sources that you believe are credible and check them regularly. And also, to deal with that filter bubble, find some things that are maybe a little outside of what you would normally look at to see, what are people who have different views from me reading, and how are these stories being presented? Because we're talking here about kind of misinformation and disinformation. We're sort of talking about objective pieces of information, but then there's also all of the shades of persuasive language and the bias that can work itself into stories. So look for indicators. I've already talked about that. Search out firsthand accounts. So if you're reading about something that's happened, at a protest, for example, look for people who were there. Look for people who, who are providing their own firsthand accounts of things. Beware of suspicious or unknown avatars and friends. So this is dealing with the bots issue. Think before you share something. So, have you done your due diligence? Because it's one thing if you believe something that is false, but ideally you don't want to be contributing to the problem and spreading it around. I put a website here, mediasmarts.ca. Mediasmarts is an organization that gets funding from the government of Canada, and they do really great programs around kind of media literacy and digital literacy. And they have this project called Reality Check, and there are some games and videos and things like that. And it sort of teaches you about how to look for some of the clues that we've talked about for deciding whether something is true and real. So that is my slide deck, and I think we have at least about 12 minutes for some questions. So I'm gonna take a look. I think there. Okay, so someone's asked, how can we determine the core difference between fact and opinion when reading articles? Are there any popular opinions that are considered as facts that you know of? So it's a really good question, and it's first of all, there are in a reputable newspaper, opinions are contained on the opinion pages, right? They are labeled as opinions or as op-ed pieces, and it's very clear that someone is laying out their view about something. Having said that, even in reputable news sources, if you read the news, you are going to see that there's often a political bent or bias that's built in. So you really, I think the only way, you can't always sort of determine the difference, but you really need to, you really just need to be aware of that as you're reading things, that everyone has some biases and their own perspectives that they bring to the stories that they write. And you can look at, the mission statement or the sort of about us page of a news outlet and often get a sense of where they're coming from, what their political leaning is. If you were to look at the Toronto Star's mission statement, it would be pretty clear that they consider themselves a progressive news organization. They're probably much more aligned on the left side of the political spectrum than the right side. And And that doesn't mean that they don't have good and accurate factual reporting, but even that good and accurate factual reporting is going to be presented in a way that may have some bias built into it. So I think the only thing you can really do is just be aware of that when you're reading it and be aware of your own biases. I mean, are there popular opinions that are considered as facts? I think that there are. Well, I guess it's really people who disagree with facts that might characterize them as opinions, right? So there obviously now there's a lot of conspiracy theorizing about COVID-19, about the virus, and there are some people out there who are saying that, you know, this isn't true, or there's not people in hospital, there's not as many people in hospitals as they say, and there's not, you know, this isn't happening and that isn't happening. And those people, I think, would probably say that it's opinion, you know, that the vast amount of information around the virus is just opinion. But you do, I think, really have to try and distinguish between what is sort of objectifiable as fact and what is opinion. And then there's facts that are going to be, you know, that it might have some shading to them. So we might all look at the same set of facts, for example, about COVID-19. We might look at the same, you know, numbers of cases, the same numbers of people in hospital, and we might come to a different conclusion about what that means for what we should do, right? So there are differences about how we interpret the facts and what we do with them. But I still think there's a pretty usually a line between fact and opinion, but it's definitely not always easy to see or to tell where that line is. Okay, what are governments doing to limit the spread of misinformation? So right now they're really looking at the problem and trying to figure out what to do about it. There's some steps that they've already taken in the kind of election context. So there are things that are built into our election laws that are designed to try and deal with, first of all, things like foreign interference. So trying to prevent foreign governments from kind of polluting our information environment and putting, you know, false information out there in terms of elections. There's right now, I'd say that, I mean, really what they're doing is kind of studying and asking people for their views and consulting with social media companies and looking at what other countries are doing to see, you know, what's working and what's not. Other countries have done more, and it's not just misinformation that they're trying to deal with. It's really harmful content online. So, I mean, I tried to give some examples in this talk of misinformation that can be used to kind of, you know, increase tensions between racial groups, for example. There's also, you know, things that are very clearly labeled as opinion that are not, it's not misinformation, but it's really hateful expression and hate speech. And we do have restrictions on hate speech in Canada. And governments are looking at ways to deal with that online. But it's really hard because the volume is huge, and it's not always based in Canada. It's not easy for the government to kind of police the boundaries of the internet, like in Canada, the same way that they can police our physical borders. So they're really at this point, I think, kind of studying the issue. There's also the more proactive things that governments can do is to just put out good information, right? So you've probably seen a lot or heard a lot from Theresa Tam, the chief, you know, the chief public health officer of Canada, or from your local from our provincial chief medical officer of health during the pandemic, right? Those are ways of the government trying to say, this is the official source of information. This is what we're putting out, and the best way that we can deal with the misinformation is just to provide you with the information that we have. So I think that's a lot of what the government is doing, and then they do fund things like Media Smarts, like I mentioned, which are you know, programs designed to to make sure that people can look at news and information critically and kind of assess it for themselves. Because ultimately, when you think of kind of the scale of this problem, I think a lot of it means that we have to be responsible for making sure that we can distinguish fact from fiction. I don't know if we're going to be able to rely on someone else to do that for us. And so part of what the government can do and is doing is funding programs that will educate people about how to do that well. Are there other questions? I'm just trying to think if there were questions that were posed that I haven't addressed. I've tried to address most of them. Anything else?
Maybe as we're waiting for them to come in, could you talk a little bit, like you mentioned, that large social media companies don't have to follow the rules of the charter, including freedom of expression rules, and that they have taken some steps to kind of address, I guess at varying levels, misinformation and disinformation and hate speech. I guess, do you think that because algorithms are so complex and they have far better insight into how their own algorithms work than the government does, do you think they're an appropriate group to look to? Do you think it's better to have a third party? Sorry, I know this is a tricky question, but
yeah, no, it's okay. It's a good question. I mean, I think that like ultimately, I guess I don't think we can rely on these companies to do all of this work for us in an altruistic way, because ultimately they are, for-profit corporations, and they want to do things that will, get advertisers to give them money, and sometimes those things are not the things that are best for us in terms of providing us with the best information. I do think that there are really, these companies have huge resources, right? Many of them have more resources than some governments, some countries' governments, and they are looking at creative ways to try and think through some of these issues. So Facebook has just launched this oversight board, and they basically created this global oversight board. They've got different kind of experts trying to represent different parts of the world globally. And they are assigning this oversight board to look at a couple of specific issues and cases where Facebook, is trying to make a decision about whether certain content can stay up or should come down. And it raises really difficult questions. And so they've said, let's get this oversight board involved. Now, it's an interesting idea. It's sort of like a private court or tribunal that's looking at these things. I don't know how well it's going to work, and it's obviously only going to deal with like the tiniest fraction of controversial issues, many of which are going to have nothing to do with us here in Canada, right? Because it's a global company, and so they're looking at issues from all over the world. But I think what they're trying to do, and you can, if you Google the Facebook Oversight Board, they just yesterday, I think, announced like the first 6 cases that they're looking at, and so you might see that they are trying to kind of represent different issues around racial and cultural divisions, issues around misinformation related to the pandemic. So I think they're trying to take themes and deal with some of those issues, but I don't know yet how well it's going to work. And ultimately they also have to try and comply with the law that exists in every jurisdiction in which they operate, which is going to be pretty challenging too.
For sure. Okay, well, thank you. It looks like we're pretty much out of time. So thank you to our students for joining us, and a big thank you to Cara for walking us through this and explaining all there is to know about this. It's a really interesting and complex area. So thank you for joining us.